Hello everyone, continuing our video series of our different collections for different video game consoles, moving on to the N64. First we'll go through our collection of games. So far, there's still a few that we want for the system. And then I want to talk a little bit about the system itself, because I've had very mixed opinions regarding the N64 over the years compared to other consoles, especially Nintendo consoles. Starting with Pilot Wings 64. This was one of Amanda's favorite N64 games, one I've never really played, one of the launch titles for the system. Super Mario 64. I actually have two copies of that. One's a little more beat up, as that marker, someone's name was probably there at one point. A nice clean copy here. But Super Mario 64, not my favorite game on the system, but definitely I would consider this to be the ultimate classic for the system, the defining game of the system, and a huge move for the Super Mario series from 2D to 3D. And again, this is one of the two launch games, and this was just such a huge deal, showcasing the capabilities of the N64 and moving into a new generation of consoles. A great classic game. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, another one of Amanda's favorite games here. A game that I played a bit of over the years, but have never actually sat down and completed. I actually do want to play the 3DS port of this game eventually. I never really got into the Zelda series, pretty much. Two of my most played games on the N64 from when I had it originally, Pokemon Stadium and Pokemon Snap. Snap is definitely my favorite Pokemon game ever. I'm not really into Pokemon, I just kind of watched the anime and played the card game, or collected them really more than played, in elementary school, and that was at the end of Pokemon for me. Actually, I have not played a Pokemon game since the N64, but I remember we played a lot of Pokemon Stadium. The party games were fun, great multiplayer, and the actual, just the stadium element, just the ability to battle your Pokemon in 3D was such a huge deal at the time. And Pokemon Snap I loved because it was such an original, creative idea, and it was similar to one of my favorite genres of games, on-rail shooters. I love those in arcades, I love playing them at home, I just love that type of game. And having sort of a combination of that with a very unique idea of taking the pictures of Pokemon, I just really enjoyed Pokemon Snap, and I'm still very confused why there's not been a sequel to that game over the years. Banjo-Kazooie, if I had to take a guess and think of what is probably Amanda's favorite game on the N64, this would be my guess. This is one that she's played a lot and just talked about a lot, and the reason why she wanted to get Ukulele on the PS4 is because it reminded her of this game. Banjo-Kazooie, Rareware, if it wasn't for Nintendo first-party games and games by Rare, there wouldn't be a whole lot on the N64, something I'll talk about later. But this company was synonymous with the N64 and with Nintendo, and it's just a shame that they then went the way of Microsoft. But Banjo-Kazooie, a classic. Another one by them, GoldenEye and Perfect Dark. I prefer Perfect Dark overall compared to GoldenEye, even though I know GoldenEye is definitely the more popular one, and in some ways it almost seems like in retrospect it's more popular than the movie. Diddy Kong Racing. Glover. One that we got years ago for cheap, almost kind of as just a joke game for the N64, Quest 64. A horrible game. I played as much of it as I could before I just said I just can't take any more of this. This is one of the worst games I've ever played. Quest 64. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later when I talk about the system itself. Daikatana. South Park, the N64. Until the Stick of Truth, South Park games were really not very good. You had the Chef's Love Shack, which was just kind of a quiz game, but the quiz had nothing really to do with South Park. It was kind of like you don't know jack in a way. And then you had the kart racing game, which was pretty terrible. And this wasn't that great of a game either, but was, I think, the best of the older South Park games. Mace the Dark Age, one of a very short list of fighting games on the N64, and an even shorter list of fighting games on the N64 that are not also on the PlayStation or Saturn. Mace the Dark Age was a great arcade game that I remember playing at the beach all the time, and was very happy to be able to get a version of this at home. Gauntlet Legends, one of the best arcade games in my opinion of all time. I love for the home versions this, and then the Dreamcast edition, which has some newer levels and things like that, but this is a great home port of the Gauntlet Legends arcade game. Hot Wheels Turbo Racing. I originally had this on the PS1, ended up finding it for the N64 years later, and this is a lot of fun. It's a surprising amount of fun. It's one of the first video games that I ever did a review for, because it is just great fun arcade racing. Xena, the Talisman of Fate. The PS1 has the amazing, like really good adventure game for Xena, and then the N64 got an exclusive fighting game, and it's actually pretty good. It's a decent fighting game in its own right. Nothing spectacular, but pretty fun. But if you're into Xena, that really brings it to a whole new level. It's a lot of fun to play if you're a fan of the show. And then Hercules Legendary Journeys. Xena had much better luck with video game adaptations. This is just a very mediocre adventure game. And it's also the only N64 game I've ever played that actually froze on me and gave me multiple errors, and it wasn't even the card itself. It's the game has programming errors in it, and it's just overall a fairly mediocre product. But being such a big fan of Hercules Legendary Journeys, I had to have it and I had to play through it, and there was some fun to be had as a fan of the franchise. And the last game we own so far, Command & Conquer 64. This is a very good port of the PC classic. Slightly different. They redid a lot of the models and things like that, so it's a different version. It's cool to get, even if you played the PC version or the ports to, say, the Saturn or PS1. This version does differ from those and is a lot of fun, and I think actually is better than the other versions and fares better than the port of Warcraft 2 to those systems. I think this is one of the better ports of a PC RTS title to consoles of that generation. So that is our collection so far for the N64. There are a handful of titles left that we're still looking to get, but not a whole lot more. It's pretty close to done. The N64 was the system that Amanda had growing up for this console generation. I also had it, but I think, off the top of my head, I think I had like 5 games for it, and that was about it. And it was a system that I got used at a garage sale just a couple years after it came out, so around 98-ish probably. And I really just had it for those couple of, those 2 Pokemon games, and then a couple other things, like, obviously I was a huge fan of Xena and Hercules at the time, so I wanted those. But I really wasn't interested in a lot with the N64. And while I enjoy it more now, and there are a couple games that I want for it in particular, StarCraft 64 is definitely the #1 game I'm looking for still on the system. It is a system that I had a very negative experience with during its heyday in the 90s, and I enjoy it much more now, but there's still things to dislike about it. One, I despise the N64 controller. It is easily my least favorite controller ever for a Nintendo console, and one of my least favorite controllers overall. I can't stand that controller. And when the system was first out, aside from those couple of games that I had that we would play very infrequently, it was definitely my least used system. I actually, even at the time, was probably still putting more hours in a given year on my NES than my N64. And then the Genesis and the PS1 and the PC and the Mac and things like that. N64 was just something you took out every once in a while to kind of, play a Pokemon game or something for a very short period of time. Other than that, my experience with the N64 was over at friends' houses. We would play a lot of multiplayer games for a couple of years there on the N64, and it was just, I can't explain how miserable the experience was of being forced to play games that you couldn't stand for hours and hours over and over, and I would just get so annoyed and just would not care. Overall, really, if you look at my video game collections and the types of games I play and the genres that I enjoy, out of all of my consoles, and handhelds and everything, I'd say roughly half our collection is RPGs, very story-heavy games, and the other half is every genre under the sun put together. And the N64, the RPG genre is virtually non-existent. You have, what's that one, the 18 Chronicles or whatever, and then you have Quest 64, which to me this is kind of represents, this is RPGs on the N64, pretty much non-existent. You get Quest 64, one or two other small examples, and that's about it. And that really killed my interest in the console almost entirely, just because it didn't have games I wanted to play for the most part. And then even the other genres that I really enjoy, I like a lot of fighting games, particularly a lot of arcade-based fighting games. Very few on the N64, and again, very few, I had the PS1, there were very few that were on the N64 that weren't also on the PS1, or the Saturn, or whatever. So, and he kept going through genres like that, and like every genre of video game that I enjoyed was either virtually non-existent on the N64 with its very limited library, or the selection was very limited and I could get it on other systems frequently cheaper. There just really wasn't a lot on the system for me to enjoy, and the majority of games in our collection were actually games that are Amanda's, not really mine. Not really games I would want to play, because it feels like the N64 to me, unless you were really into 3D platformers and a lot of multiplayer games, it's kind of a worthless console. There's very little left on it. That's really where it shines. It's really good at a very limited, very narrow selection of video games. It's very, very good in a classic system for a very narrow section of games, and that's about it. And if you're not really into the types of games that Rare was putting out, and if you're not really into a lot of Nintendo first-party games, which I've never been into, you're left with a very, very small library of games to choose from, and that's why I never really got into the N64. And again, I appreciate it more now, and there are some games for it that I really do enjoy. It just wasn't a system for me. And at the time, we were playing, again, I was talking about at friends' houses, endlessly we'd play something like GoldenEye. I've never, ever, ever liked GoldenEye. At the time, I was playing first-person shooters. So I was playing them with mouse and keyboard on the PC, and playing things that to me were just so much better in so many ways. I could never get used to the controls in GoldenEye to this day. The combination of the type of game that it was and the controller, I totally get it for people that were only N64 owners, and I understand why it was popular and a lot of fun, but I couldn't control it. I just couldn't get a hang of it. I couldn't stand it. And then having to play that for hours just left a sour taste in my mouth. And the other thing was Smash Brothers. I love fighting games. I don't understand the appeal of Smash Brothers outside of, if you're a big fan of, again, all the Nintendo characters. If there are a lot of people that are just loyal Nintendo, they love all the first-party characters and franchises, and I get the appeal from that perspective. But since I don't really have that attachment, I don't really get any enjoyment out of Smash Brothers. I've never liked Smash Brothers, and I've probably played 60 plus hours at least of the original Smash Brothers in N64 and didn't enjoy a second of it. So that was, my experience with the N64 was just so negative in the beginning, because I had a couple of games, and everything else that I played was just a game I didn't like and was forced to play endlessly. And yeah, even compared to something like the Wii U, not only is the library comparatively small on the N64. If you look at the makeup of the libraries, the Wii U has far more titles that would interest me and are the type of games that I would play. The N64, so like, as far as a main Nintendo console, the N64 is probably my least favorite. It just doesn't have the types of games that I like to play. And I know it sounds, pretty negative on the N64. I just have very mixed emotions with it, because I do have just so many negative opinions on the N64 and so many negative experiences, but at the same time, it's such an important console for Nintendo, showing the transition of all these companies that I loved, that were like Square, that were Nintendo companies. They were, if I wanted to play Final Fantasy, I was playing it on a Nintendo console. Chrono Trigger, all the games that I love to play on home consoles were Nintendo things, really. And then they just left. Everything was PS1, and everything just, this was such a turning point for Nintendo that they've had to struggle back from ever since. And it's a console that, living through that time period and having multiple systems, it really left a sour taste in my mouth, but was an important console to own. And I'm very glad, though, that I ended up marrying someone who was an N64 owner, a very happy N64 owner back in the 90s, because it made me want to re-get it and get back into the system. And I've actually enjoyed it far more now than at the time. In hindsight, re-enjoying some of these older games and having some of these games that I feel are important to have in the collection if I do have an N64, and then other games that actually are better memories for the system, and finding some new experiences. So yeah, overall, my relationship to the N64 is complicated, but it is, again, a very iconic system, and for what it does do well, it does extremely well. It's just that is a very limited thing.